Joyce Kimutai is a climate scientist at the Kenya Meteorological Services, and we're talking today. There's a word here that does the tumble on me every time: the role of anthropogenic climate change in extreme weather climate conditions. It started raining after years of it being very dry, because we're talking about years in parts of the country. So Joyce, as we get into this conversation today, let's start with some definitions of what is what. You're saying there's the role that anthropogenic climate change plays in the climate situation. Let's start with what is that in the first place? What is anthropogenic climate change?
Thank you so much, and that is a really fantastic question. And I like speaking a lot about like really explaining what that means, because I think it's really fundamental for people to understand what we mean by anthropogenic climate change. So before, at the moment, our climate has warmed by over 1 degree compared to 1850. Why am I saying this? 1850 is the time where we had not started to heavily industrialize. So there've been changes in the climate system, and there've been variability in the climate system. We've had floods, we've had droughts, we've had any type of extreme events happening. But it's important to say that when human activities became a bit intensified, there was a lot of emissions of gases that we call greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And what those gases do is they create sort of a blanket in the atmosphere. So they trap heat. So there's the heat that comes from the sun, which we call the shortwave radiation, but then it has to reflect back into the sky. But then because these gases are present and they're creating sort of like an umbrella, which we call it like a greenhouse effect, they warm. So that warming is what has happened, and the result of that warming is the changes in the patterns of weather.
Okay.
So it's like an athlete on like sort of steroid or something. Like you are the system would perform normally, but then now there's like an added effect of the warming.
I think for the first time I've heard that greenhouse effect explained to me just now properly. So we're saying the gases have created a cover over the atmosphere, right, over the earth, and what would ordinarily be all right for plants in a greenhouse is not all right for the earth in general.
Exactly. So we have. So there should be a balance in the system, and there's always a balance. But when you emit so much in a way that it cannot be synced, and I'll explain what syncing means. But that is the taking out. So there's the natural sinks, like our forests take a lot of CO2, carbon dioxide. Our ocean take a lot of that. So there's normally that balance. So of course we can industrialize, we can emit, but then there should be the balance between what goes into the atmosphere and what sinks back. But then now we've heavily industrialized in a way that there's sort of a net positive, like there's too much. So that blanket has been created in a way that it has now warmed the globe. And so that warming of the globe has altered everything else that happens in there. So for example, you're trapped in this room. So instead of you breathing normally, they introduce a gas that keeps warming this room. So if there's nothing that takes out the gas from this room, with time, you get yourself being overwarmed or something. I don't know if that's such a word exists, but then you're starting to get hot and hotter with time. And that is what is happening exactly to our planet.
Okay.
At the heart...
Go ahead, CT.
May I?
Yes.
At the heart of this discussion seems to be a gas we refer to as CO2. Okay, now, I'm going back to primary school when I was first taught about these things. And I was told that the interesting balance between human beings and nature, okay, is that what we produce is what now nature uses to grow, and vice versa. So it means the trees and the foliage that we see helps absorb the CO2. Okay. Now, every time I hear the discussion about climate change, I go back to my primary school and ask myself, are we saying that what's being produced as a factor of industrialization, that these gases are overwhelming nature, so that the natural processes where all these gases could be utilized and would be part of this cyclical matter that we call life. Are we saying that too much of these gases are being produced so that now we've actually destabilized that balance that is supposed to exist in nature?
That is exactly the point. That is exactly how it is. Since the beginning of time, there's been this balance, the way you're saying, that our plants use CO2 to photosynthesize. It's a normal process. So there's the taking of the CO2. So there's been a balance in our system, and it's already been a natural sort of a balance. Also, the oceans taking our CO2. Yeah. Yes. So there's been the balance. But what the problem with the situation now is we are overwhelming the system. So we are creating imbalance in the system. And that imbalance in the system is what is causing the warming. So CO2 is like, where am I supposed to go? And the problem with it is that's the blanket thing that it creates. So it traps the heat. And when it traps the heat, then the temperatures rise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who is we?
It is humans. It's us. So when we say anthropogenic, we say human-induced. So it's human-induced. It's the influence of humans in the system. If, for example, humans were not interfering with the system in a way that we've interfered now, and it's a result of us trying to industrialize, do more, it's a good thing. We've advanced where we are because of these technological advancements. The revolutions, we are now going to the fourth industrial revolution. So the 1, 2, 3 has really made us be where we are.
Okay.
So we've overwhelmingly emitted so much into our planet, into our atmosphere, in a way that we're warming it now, and we're seeing all these impacts happening to us.
When we say we, humans, we're still talking about a collective engagement of humans across the globe who are doing this. So then are we saying at the same time that even those who are struggling to industrialize today, the BRICS, looking at this part of the global south, who are struggling to industrialize, because the industrialization that we talk about in the global south, for example, is nowhere in comparison to the industrialization that has taken place in the north and the west, and what continues to take place. I read an article just yesterday that says, even if the global south were to continue in its quest for industrialization for the next 10 years at the level at which the north did over the last 20, we would be nowhere in terms of reaching. So my question is, who are we talking about here?
So we are talking about, so it was, when I said we, it was very intentional actually. And it's because we have a responsibility as humanity in totality to deal with climate change. But then we won't forget that there are people who have more responsibility than others. We normally say we have common but differentiated responsibility. So we are saying that there are people who have found themselves where they are now at the expense of others. And when I say that, I mean some countries have industrialized more. They started this process. They've had decades and centuries of industrialization. They are where they are at the expense of other countries. And when I say at the expense, it means they've been emitting while these other countries have actually not have contributed as much in the mission. So when we talk about responsibility, it's important to say that for sure, there are nations that need to take high ambition. They need to have high ambition on this. They have more responsibility. And we are now talking about international cooperation for us to fight this. We are saying, the Global South is saying that, guys, also we need to industrialize. We are developing nations. we need, but then the development has to be sustainable. But even with that, it has to be the support of the global north as well in this. So there could be like capacity development, technology transfer. There's so many other international cooperations that need to take place. We are saying we're in this together, but then there are people who need to really do more than others.
Sure. So when we say that industrialization and manufacturing takes place, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer from where we are, that if we're looking at the global south, if we're going to get ourselves out of the things that, cloud up our progress in terms of development, manufacturing and industrialization is top. Mechanization of different sectors needs to happen. We need to start building and making our own, and those processes are through the processes of industrialization. We cannot run away from it. But the question is, if we're going to go ahead and do that in order to ensure and guarantee development to the place where we're able to compete on a global scale, and at the same time mitigate climate change factors, what is it that ought to be done? Look at the climate, and we're talking about this anthropogenic contribution towards climate change. All right, we get it, that there's certain things that we do as humans that affect the climate, but there also must be something that can be done to either reduce the negative effects or to claw back on some of those retrogressive activities.
I think that's an interesting question. And I think it's important to say that we do not necessarily have to industrialize the way they did. We're not talking about sustainable development. So we are saying we could use sources of power, sources of energy that are more sustainable. So we can use renewable energy, for example. And Africa has a huge resource in renewable energy. Kenya is leading, for example, in that. So we are tapping our renewable energy. We don't necessarily have to use coal or other dirty sources of energy to industrialize. But then, yes, I agree that we need to industrialize. It's important for us to industrialize. But then with the international cooperation, because also utilizing these resources is capital intensive as well. So we need a lot of international cooperation to work together towards this, to help the global south industrialize. So, but then it's really important to say that if we look at sustainable development, which is a very key word, and a lot of people have talked about leapfrogging, and we can do that actually by utilizing our renewable resources in a way that it can enable us to leapfrog, to be able to be at par with the global north. It might not be easy, but then that's why I say it needs really a lot of support. It needs a lot of cooperation, a lot of conversations. What needs to be done, and I'm a very big advocate of African solutions for African problems. I think we have the solutions with us. There's a lot of neglect on even the use of indigenous knowledge, for example, in our farming systems, in our way we do things, and even the way we understand the climate, for example, and the way we address the impacts of climate change, and the way we adapt to the changes. So there's a lot. There's a huge potential, for example, for Africa. I'm speaking for Africa here, but this can actually just it cuts across all the global south. But in Africa there's huge potential for us to we have so much resources at hand. We just have to be organized. We need to have real conversations among ourselves. We need to know what exactly we want to get us to where we want to go. And I think that is something that can happen, and I'm optimistic that this would happen in our continent.
These discussions, I often find them puzzling. You know why? It is clear that we have very drastic climate changes, some of which one can't easily even predict. But at the same time now, when one goes into history, I was, in my reading, I came across a term that I didn't even know existed, but I came across it anyway. Paleoclimatologist. I know of paleontologists, but this is now paleoclimatologists. When one looks at the various ages that this planet has been through, the ice age we've had 5 ice ages, yes, for instance. Now, What is interesting is that it's been interspaced with periods of extreme cold where icicles formed almost everywhere. And then the converse happened. Then you had periods of extreme heat when ice melted. So there are things which are similar to this day and age where you find extreme drought on the one hand, then more rain than you know what to do with on the other. And so there are those who argue, but these changes and these patterns and these extremities have been experienced in the past. Even when there wasn't a single factory on earth, we didn't even know the word factory existed. So, but now we have a situation that mirrors what was seen before, but oddly enough, it seems to be more adverse. Is it that we know more? We are many in terms of those who are affected. So the discussion now encompasses the numbers as well as now the knowledge we now have of what happens. But when you have that discussion, the question that comes now to my mind when I look at all this is, now I'm bordering on conspiracy theory. Yeah, what I'm about to say borders on conspiracy theory. Do we really have a climate change problem?
Yeah, I know it sounds like a conspiracy indeed.
I'm asking because what we're experiencing is new to us, but I'm saying it has happened before.
Okay, I really enjoy this discussion. I mean, I really enjoy, especially that part of the conversation, because when you ask that, it's as a climate scientist, I've been asked that question, or rather, I have encountered that question like I can't remember the number of times, and I understand why it's a pertinent question. It's because people want to understand like what's so different in this time, like. Why? I mean, why are we so much in this conversation? Why are we so alarmed? And you talked about paleoclimate. So paleoclimate, they look at the historical sort of records of climate data.
Yes, they do.
They look at tree rings, for example. They look at rock sediments or such like things. So they dig into the past to understand what might have happened. And I'll give you a very interesting fact that for the last 2,000 years, we are at the highest warming of our system. I mean, that graph just goes high like that. But definitely, I want to talk about the ice ages that have happened. So what was happening in those times, it was like a sort of a natural variability of the system. Yes. So it goes up and comes down. It goes up and comes down. And the way we said that, in a way, nature sort of knows how to balance itself.
Yes.
So we've had droughts in the past. I'm not saying we've never had droughts. We've had floods, extreme rainfall in the past. We've even had heat waves in the past.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. But for the thing with now is that we have additionally influenced this system. So it's not happening the way it was happening. So it's not the natural variability. And the natural variability is very normal. You know, like something like, I'll give you a very good example of natural variability of the climate system, something like El Nino. I think many people are conversant with that. That is just as a result of the interaction, we call it the coupling of the ocean and the atmosphere, causes sort of that, so there's like a normalized warming of some part of the Pacific Ocean at a particular time. And it normally has like a 5-year cycle or something like that. So just that is just a good example of like internal variability of the system or a natural variability of the system. But the problem with climate change or the influence of humans on the system is that they've modified the variability of the system, the natural variability of the system. And what exactly I research on, and we call it attribution science, we like understand the role and the contribution of anthropogenic, the human influence bit of it, is that we try to see these floods, these droughts, these heat waves, how has climate change modified them? Of course, they used to happen, yes. Yeah. But are they becoming more frequent?
And are we saying then that the factor that has made them become more frequent is then human?
Exactly.
The human contribution is what is making things worse.
Yeah. Or the magnitude. Like, for example, we would have, like we're now seeing like multi-year droughts, for example, in Horn of Africa. We never used to see that before. Of course, it has happened. We've had droughts in the past, but we're sort of starting to see like a very extended period of drought. We are starting to see like tropical cyclones come all the way to Tanzania, and even hit all the way into Malawi. And we are seeing a possibility of them going even further. So we are trying to say that these things have happened in the past, but what climate change is doing is sort of modifying them. Yeah.
So, yeah, it has been doom and gloom. COP27 was doom and gloom. The COP before that was maybe even worse. We're going to Dubai for COP28, and already the conversation is, no. We can be clamoring and having these conversations about the North and the South, the East and the West and their contribution, but the bottom line is that something has to be done. Before we went to the break, Joyce, we're talking about CT's conspiracy, maybe not too far from the mark here, that these cyclical events took place historically. But you've said, yes, they did, and they're still happening, but what is making them worse is the human factor. So what are we going to do? Are we going to move to Mars? I mean, we're here, right? So what happens?
Maybe we might have to go to Mars at some point if we do nothing. I mean, for sure. As in,
are you saying we are too many for the earth to sustain?
Well, the way we're behaving is bad manners.
We are saying that we are so bad-mannered, sorry to use that word, but I think that is true, in a way that we are forgetting that we actually have only this planet. People have started talking about Mars, but we're not sure if it's habitable. We are not sure if we're going to survive there. So we have to do something about the only home we have. And for sure, the main key things is reduction of greenhouse gases. That is number one on the list. It's a priority. And our biggest responsibility has to come from the biggest emitters. And these are China, India, and other countries. I mean, those are the biggest emitters so far. They have to, step up their game. And also we're saying, but because the damage has already been done, you talked about COP27, COP26. One interesting that came out of COP27, and I'm happy about it. It could be the only thing, but to me, I think it was a positive thing to me, is the fact that we started really having real conversations on compensation for loss and damages. And I'm going to explain what that means. It means that the damage that has been done already is to a point where we can't adapt. And what that means is, so in adaptation, we have there's a term called soft limits of adaptation, and we have the hard limits. The soft limits is when we still have feasible, the measures for adaptation are still feasible, and we can still put them in place. But when you talk about hard limits to adapt to climate change, it means there's really nothing much we can do other than just absorb the impacts. And most countries that are highly vulnerable now are crying and saying, guys, because of the historical responsibility that you had, you really have to support us in reconstruction and rehabilitation. And that is what we call like compensation for losses and damages. And at COP27, there was a funding mechanism for loss and damage that is now, so the debate on like operationalizing that is ongoing. So hopefully by COP28 in Dubai, we'll have like a solid way forward in how that can happen. So what are we saying? We are saying that mitigation is number one. Of course, we need to continually adapt. It's important. But at the same time, we are saying there are communities that are already suffering from this. And we are saying we really need to support them. And the biggest emitters, the countries that are highly responsible for these damages, should actually pay these countries to recover from this, because they need to live their lives. There are islands, for example, like Fiji and other islands, that they think in the next 15 or so years, they'll be underwater. So they're saying, we want your support. We will be in water because of you.
Let's localize this a little bit to maybe get a broader, firmer understanding about then what it really means. Because if we're talking about loss and compensation, which is it's a conversation that grabs the headlines of the conferences such as COP. So let's look at Kenya.
Yeah.
You see these climate patterns every day. What do we see in the environment today that points us to this being damaged because of some kind of environmental shift that happened somewhere else?
So, and that is what exactly Attribution Science tries to answer. So, for example, we just published a paper that I was leading on attribution of the drought. And last year I looked at the floods that happened in 2016, 2018, and 2012. And when you find for sure, when you find the quantification or the role of human-induced climate change in sort of increasing the severity of that extreme event, you know for sure that it's humans that are responsible for that. And you look at the damages that resulted from that, and you can say we can directly link that extreme event to those damages that happened. So if people died, if livestock died, if the losses that people lost their property. Sometimes from the floods, they get swept away. So you are saying that it's actually linking the role of humans. And when we talk about the role of humans, we are specifically talking about, the major contributor is greenhouse gases that has warmed the atmosphere. That is directly linked to those impacts. And then you can say, we are making the link. So we are saying, for example, it's because of this quantification that we've made, and it has linked to the impacts that we have. And we are in a situation where we've lost so much as a country. We are spending so much to respond to these extreme events because, the government has spent so much money responding to this. It's really, even like the people, their livelihoods are quite impacted. If you go to the northern Kenya, for example, they're suffering a lot. They're losing their animals, they're dying. It brings out other things like conflict. Because resources become scarce when there's like lack of water, you get. So, there's so much that comes with that, and there's so much damage and impact. And it's not just about like the physical impacts or the economic impacts, but there's also the non-economic impacts, like the mental trauma that people go through. When the droughts in the northern Kenya now have become so common in a way that a Turkana or a Maasai would just know that in the next 2 years, I'm likely to lose this herd of cattle.
So this is the thing. Okay, so if we're looking at extreme conditions that have been caused as a result of warming the earth, greenhouse gases, to which the people in a particular area did not contribute maximally to, and here we are saying that there's then something that you ought to do about it. My question is, what is that? Okay, I'll give you an example. Farmers are told to, replane their soil. You harvest your maize, in the interim plant something else like beans or groundnuts. You put nitrates into the soil and then you get it back so you can plant maize again. Yes? So, and that's something that they can do. They see it, we can do it so that we will have a better harvest later. We're not going to plant on the same soil again because we keep taking away from the soil. Do something that's going to put back. And my question is that doing something that's going to put back? Whereas the thing that caused this trauma that you're going through, you didn't do it. So what are you then supposed to do as a country like Kenya or Ethiopia or Uganda, if we're just looking at this basin area? What are you supposed to do? What should policies actually look like to reverse some of the damage, if possible, or to secure the environment for the future? What needs to happen? That's
an interesting question, and I like it, and the reason for that is that we might say that for sure it's the emitters that are responsible for this. So there's the historical responsibility. It has happened, but I think the way you said that. It's also really upon us to look at ourselves and say, what can we do about this? So. It's sad that, for example, we might at one point say, the livestock, the pastoral communities might have to change their livelihoods. But that to me, I see it as a very feasible. I see as the climate continues to warm, I see that as happening. But I don't want to talk about that because that's a very drastic thing. But I thought it was important to put that to say, actually, we might go into a point where we have to do much more than we think. But then I think what you just said is, I think we have to put policies in place. We have to say, how can we rehabilitate our lands, for example? How can we make them more productive? How can we call it modifying? So it's like microclimates. You have to modify the local climate to absorb the shocks. We have to improve like the early warning system. For example, as Kenya Met Department, we have to be able to warn early enough. We have to be able to inform the responding arms of the government early enough about, like, for example, a drought that is coming, an extreme rainfall that is coming, to say we need to respond early enough so that we don't get to react to these events when they happen. We don't have to say, people are already dying in northern Kenya and we need to buy food, social security protection, or distribution of cash or something like that. We have to understand that things have changed. I think that is very important. We have to understand that the system has changed, and we have to change the ways we're doing things. So we have to change our ways, for example. And I use the example of, livestock keeping might have to change, but I'm not saying that has to change. I'm just saying that we have to see that things are not the same. They're not. It's not business as usual anymore. Like, we have to do better. We have to see how. We have to look at, for example, local indigenous crops that can do well. Drought-resistant crops, for example, that can do well in areas that have now become very prone to droughts. We have to harvest water, for example, when there's extreme rainfall, so that we can use this water when the drought comes. So we have to really change the ways we are doing things. We have to educate our pastoralists on how they can prepare better for a drought. If they have to sell their livestock and then regain it back so that they don't have to wait for all of them to die and incur all those losses. So we are saying the conversation, the narrative has to change because things are changing. We have to completely change the way we do our things. And it trickles down all the way from, I think, the policies that we design at the national level, all the way to the county level, to the communities. So, we have to do a lot of community education in order to build their resilience. So we are saying communities have to be more resilient to these shocks. They have to learn to adapt better. How can they be more food secure even as this climate changes? Of course, we'll be waiting. There's the international, cooperation to address this issue, but there is the role of the local people to say that as much as this is an issue that is affecting us, as much as this is a global issue and there's a responsibility of other people, we also have our own personal responsibilities and roles to play in adapting and combating this.
This conversation, there's an area of it that I'm at least stuck, like a dog with a bone. It's this conversion of CO2 into oxygen and balancing these negative emissions and all these things converging on forest cover. And scientists like our delightful sister here who study earth and environmental sciences will tell you that they even have formulas where they'll tell you this quantity of negative harmful emissions can be absorbed by this number of green cover, forest cover, and what have you. Now, 31% of this planet has forest cover. Yeah. Are we saying that the forest cover that we have has been overwhelmed by the emissions that we have, and that this balance and this science that tells us how it is, this balance can come about, has also been overwhelmed? What are we saying?
We are saying exactly that, and I will explain. we are so last year we just released this so we normally have like a 5 cycle of doing a global scientific report on climate change, and it's done by a panel called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there's a report that came out last year saying that the effectiveness of the natural sinks is declining rapidly. So you're saying that the trees, 31% that we have in the globe, the effectiveness of that, the efficacy of that is going down drastically.
Why?
So because we are overwhelming these things. We are not allowing the system to balance. We are continually
Burdening it
in a way that it's becoming untenable for it to take what it's supposed to take. It's like saying, I can't take this is too much for me. I can't take this much. And so that is it. But
would growing more trees help?
So that's a conversation that I would really like to talk about it today, because I think there's a lot of, I can't call it misconception, but I'll just call it lack of sort of the scientific understanding of, or like, like there's the interdependence of like climate, biodiversity, and people. So and climate action, actually, it's really important to talk about like sustainable development when you're talking about climate action, eradication of poverty, especially in countries that are in the global south, for example. So we're talking about food insecurity, for example. So we are saying, how much of the arable land we have? Do we want to plant trees in all these lands? And what about food security?
But are trees the only? Are they the only plants we have on the planet that can help?
That can help this situation.
Yes.
Because that's the gospel that has been preached. Yeah.
No, it's not only trees. It's any sort of plant. Any green matter will absorb. It's only that trees have sort of because it has
the size,
the surface area. So like a sink rate or a sink proportion of one tree may be sort of equivalent to like 4 other plants, small plants. You get what I mean? So I'm saying that's why like trees have like sort of a bigger sinking capacity. But then trees is not the only solution. We can do agroforest, for example. We can say we can plant our trees and plant our crops and see. We can look at other crops, like other green matter that can be put on land, which at the same time will support our food systems, will make us food secure, but at the same time we are sinking our carbon. Because there's a real issue now with there's a term called maladaptation, and maladaptation is it's unintended adverse impacts in the process of adapting to climate change. So you were saying, for example, I wanted to plant trees to adapt to climate change, but then you are either destroying the ecosystem around there, or you are affecting the food security of the people living there. So it's like you're not providing solutions per se, but rather you're creating problems. So there should be that really balance of saying, how much do we need to do, and what measures do we need to put in place to adapt to climate change? But at the same time, we want to develop. We want to be food secure. We want to feed our people. People need food and water.
You know, every time we talk about trees and food security, it's as though the two are separate. But there are trees that would actually help you with food security because they actually produce food.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it also time that there seem to be so many talking heads in this climate change conversation? Isn't it time for some kind of streamlining for everybody who's involved in this conversation to come together, because that's what then would be able to fuel policy, and then now we start to have the conversations and the actions around these things that you're talking about. Everybody says, well, let's plant a tree. Is there something in this area that can be done differently? It's about time that folks stop working in silos and come together on this climate change per country.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest discussions going on at the moment. Like there's a call for a lot of transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I mean, when for example, we started understanding about when the understanding of climate change started, and when the sort of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988, there was still the understanding of like looking at the physical sciences on its own, looking at the adaptation on its own, social science on its own. But now we are at the point where we cannot work like that anymore. We have to work together. People from the energy sector, from the water sector, if it's for scientists like us who are doing like sort of the natural understanding of the system or the physical understanding of the system, we need to work together, because then our efforts have to be in line. We shouldn't be having this voice saying this and this voice saying this. And you know, I think everyone has, of course, a space in all this, but at the same time, I think if we put our efforts together, we're going to move even faster and better.
Indeed. Joyce Kimutai, climate scientist with the Kenya Meteorological Department, thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously a conversation that cannot stop even as action is taking place. Come again. The conversation continues, and we hope that you'll be with us to talk about it again in the future. Asante sana for being on Kenya's biggest conversation this morning. As the climate conversation continues, we hope you'll join us again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.